Asia Minor, the Middle East,
Ó,
North Africa.
os caras falando dos arcos. Esse é um arco composto. E é mais eficiente do que o arco longo, né? Que os europeus usavam. Por que os caras usavam tão longo? Vou assistir esse vídeo enquanto eu faço o de hoje. Dia 11, ou seja, o 6º dia já de braço. Tem algum efeito? Tem alguma coisa? Comprei uma proteína. Para chegar eu vou ver se vai, se funciona alguma coisa. Então, hoje vai ser a mesma coisa da vez passada. Vai ser 8 vezes 4 de 8. E é isso aí. Da outra vez eu consegui fazer 8, 8, 8 e depois eu fiz 6. Morri. Eu fiz 5. Morri na sexta. Foi 6, eu morri na sétima. Aí agora vamos ver se eu vou aí dar a mesma coisa, se eu tô pior, se eu tô melhor, se eu vou pifar, se você tem algum progresso, né? E eu vou conseguir fazer o 8.
Didn't people like the English and French switch to use them? Well, one of the first answers that people usually come up with is availability. The fact that, well, they didn't have them in places like England or France at the time, so they didn't use them because they didn't have them. But they absolutely could have done in a number of ways. I'm going to refer to a source in a second to back this up. But first of all, they could have imported them. These longbows, people often think that the English longbow was made of English wood. In fact, by the late medieval period, the best longbows were almost never made of English wood. They were usually made of Italian yew, Spanish yew, sometimes imported from what was then Prussia, or essentially now Poland. So these were often made of imported wood, so much so that Italian merchants trading in the port of London actually often had to pay a form of tax or tariff, very topical, in the form of bow staves from Italy. So these were imported, these weren't even native. So that's the first thing, they could have been imported. The second thing is, there was actually a native, in other words, sort of indigenous manufacturing industry for making composite bows. So often when we talk about composite bows made of wood, horn and sinew, we think about these recurve bows as used by the Turks and the Mamluks and various other people. But in reality, many crossbows were made in the same way. So many crossbow prods or bows were actually made in an extremely simple way with a laminate process. So number one, English
Tô fraco já. Bebi um pouco de Bacardi com... Como é o negócio, velho? Com maracujina. Maracujá do mato. E esse Bacardi eu tenho um tempo, então não tem metanol não, que eu já bebi metade. Mas quando acabar, o pai vai ficar sem bebida. E o álcool afeta, né? Será que isso tá coisando? Eu já me senti fraco já nessa primeira. Tô sem disposição hoje também. Mas bora ver, né?
But certainly some of them in art must have been composite recurve bows. And of course we know that other parts of Europe, like Hungary for example, used composite recurve bows, loads of them. So, and that really wasn't that far away. Bear in mind that someone like Henry V, he gave a famous sword to the King of Hungary. So if he wanted to import bows from Hungary, he could have done. And to give a textual evidence of the fact that they did actually have these types of bows in England, we've got here, so this is a brilliant book. It's called A Medieval Arms and Armour, a Source Book by Ralph Moffat. You can find that online. I highly recommend you search it up if you're interested in 14th century arms and armour. And this is a source which is stored in the National Archives in Kew in London, not that far away from me. It dates to, it's an inventory of goods owned by Roger Mortimer, the Earl of March, in Herefordshire, and it dates to 1322. So it's a massive thing, but we've got a translation here as well. And it lists all sorts of things. It talks about 14 vice-spanned horn crossbows. It talks about 130 quarrels, 70 which are fletched with copper and 60 with wood fletchings. It goes into huge amounts of detail about the ordnance, in other words, what he kept at the castle, Wigmore Castle this was, in his armoury, essentially. And there's something listed here which I was like, what? It says, amongst the many things, it comes after 2 chapeau de fers with visors. Chapeau de fer with visor, that's interesting. Maybe another video in that. 6 helms for tourneying. Yeah, this is all regular. 6 helms, quite a lot actually. So these are jousting helmets. These are all the regular sorts of things you expect an English knight of 1322 to have access to. And then I'm like, what? 2 Saracen bows with 3 Saracen arrows. After that is 1 iron mace, and I actually have a suspicion that's actually a Saracen iron mace, because actually they were actually famous for maces. Okay, it was their major anti-armour weapon that they used against the Crusaders, and in fact we actually have records from the Crusades that talk about the maces. And there was actually I think it was the Knights Templar, I think, were given special permission, because they weren't usually allowed to use Saracen weapons, but they were allowed to use the maces. But anyway, that's a tangent. So it talks about Saracen bows. Well, first of all, what are they talking about? They're almost certainly talking about a recurve composite bow. What do they mean when they say Saracen? That can mean various different things in this period. It probably means Turks of some sort. It could mean Syrian, it could mean possibly Persian, but it probably means...
Eu já senti e fiquei lento, será que vai mais dois desse? Mas de uma certa forma senti mais leve do que o outro, eu já estava mais esperando, mais preparado ou alguma coisa.
Many Europeans fought a massive battle, the Battle of Nicopolis, Agincourt. In 1396, Marshal Boucicaut was there. He got captured by the Ottomans. So combined allied forces of the Ottomans fought against combined allied forces of various Europeans, both Eastern and Western European forces, including Burgundian knights, for example, and Marshal Boucicaut. And the Ottoman Turks won. And absolutely, they would have been using composite recurve bows at the Battle of Nicopolis. But if there were French archers there, for example, there weren't any English there, as far as I know. If there were, I think there might have been a couple of English knights actually, but there weren't generally speaking English forces. But if there were French archers there, they would have used longbows. So, given that the recurve bow is a more efficient bow, it can shoot arrows faster, which is better for armour penetration, generally speaking, and they can shoot arrows further. Why, oh why, and given that we've seen that they even had ways of getting these composite recurve bows, why did northwestern European nations like England and France persist with using simple wooden bows? So the first obvious answer has to be availability. Okay, so if you're going to equip whether it's a militia or it's an entire army, it is far easier to use native woods which make pretty damned well effective bows and just put them in really high draw weights. It's easier to do that if you're in England or France, rather than trying to manufacture or import a type of bow which you can't produce in such great numbers. Now, this is the common point people go to, and fundamentally I think it's sort of true. However, we also have to point out that the Ottomans fielded some pretty freaking huge armies, as did the Mamluks and everybody else, and they used recurve bows. So, you know, and whether we could go all the way over to India or China, you know, the Ming dynasty, the fact is that there were other civilizations that did manage to mass produce enough of these recurve bows to use them for huge armies. So I actually don't find that a hugely convincing point. Now, the next point that comes up is a traditionally made horn, sinew and wooden composite bow is apparently, according to the wisdom of the interwebs, is less durable than a stick. Okay, now on the surface of it, that might seem like common sense. If this gets rained on or gets wet in some way in the famously wet England, even though Paris has higher annual rainfall than London does, but apparently if you're in the wet or in nasty European weather that we have here apparently, then these bows are apparently going to perish. Tell that to the Hungarians, tell that to the Mongols, tell that to the Indians.
For years,
all of these places have extremes of weather, extreme cold and extreme heat and lots of rain. There's famously quite a lot of rain in India about.
Será que prestou me gravar com a câmera frontal?
Famously also use composite bows. Funny enough, in India, they also have simple longbows as well. So, I don't find that a convincing argument either, the durability issue, because frankly, yes, fundamentally a stick is more
Carai, tô
heavy
cansado.
than a more delicate composite object. But just looking at the historical context, we absolutely know that from the steppes of Russia all over Mongolia and China and India and North Africa and Eastern Europe, they were using composite recurve bows, so it didn't stop them from using them. Now another argument
Pesou o oitavo, viu? Tava
is that
morrendo já.
longbows, especially in high draw weights, can shoot
Dessa vez eu consegui mais 8.
arrows, which are really good.
Da outra vez eu morri mesmo, fiquei assim,
There's a bit of a
pifado.
problem with this.
No caso, como eu já falei todas as outras vezes, eu nem sinto no peitoral, nem no zetóio do ombro.
Okay,
É
so
tudo
when
aqui.
these longbows started
Então eu tô
becoming
treinando
really
só isso
prevalent
aqui
in
intensivamente.
England and France, for example,
Da outra
people
vez
were
eu
just
tava
wearing
pifado
mail.
mesmo, agora
They were
parece
just
que eu
wearing
acho que vai dar.
chainmail. Okay, so you don't need super heavy bows in that case because, as many tests have shown, even 60-pound draw weight longbows can put arrows through chainmail. Okay, so you don't necessarily need really heavy arrows or really heavy bows in that period. Later on, if we come forward to the 14th and 15th centuries, when we do have this kind of super heavy armour period in Europe, well, then we've got a problem as well, because do you know who really successfully used these bows? The Ottoman Turks. And who were the Ottoman Turks fighting against? The same European forces that these were being used against. So the exact same people who were being shot with these bows were also being shot with these bows. We can also, if you like, go all the way over to China. We can go to the Ming Dynasty in China and we find that there are types of Chinese bow which indeed are usually longer than this Turkish bow. The Turkish bows are particularly short, but they are nevertheless composite recurve bows, and they are shooting whopping great heavy arrows with anti-armour points on them. And yes, okay, they're training to shoot at faces, but they are nevertheless also designed to shoot at people with heavy armour on. So we find a lot of the same challenges that we have in 14th century Europe for the bow. You have exactly the same challenges in China, because you've got people in quite heavy levels of armour, and you've got bows and arrows adapting to counter those. So at this point you might be thinking, okay Matt, you've just debunked, or at least attempted to debunk, all of the main points why people say that these bows were more popular in England and France, for example, Northwest Europe, compared to these bows. And yes, I have debunked them all, so I have to come up with an answer. So what is my answer? Well, first of all, I want to say I don't necessarily have all the answers. I'm constantly trying to learn, theorise, and bounce ideas off you guys as well. So at this point, I welcome you to post down below. What do you think are the most important factors for why the English, the French, and let's face it, most Western Europeans preferred these simple wooden bows to these composite recurve bows? Even if on paper, scientifically, we know that these bows are better in a lot of ways compared to these bows. So, having said that I don't necessarily know the answer, I am going to give one possible answer. And it comes down to how the bows are used. So you will notice that a lot of the places where these short composite recurve bows are used, they are used from mounted positions. Okay, not always, obviously they had foot archers as well, but very often these bows are used in hit and run tactics by mounted archers, okay, by people who would ride in,
Tudo errado, né? Deve terminar um vídeo, tem mais 2 vídeos abertos aqui.
and then they'd move around somewhere
Geopolítica.
else. And so they would harry the enemy constantly
O
from
plano de
distance.
Labor de
That is
construir
an
12 novas
entirely different
cidades
use to
do
these
nada.
bows, which were almost entirely used.
E a União
On foot.
Europeia na merda de
Now,
sempre.
we don't
Tentando tirar a
categorically know
unanimidade
that
para
we
poder
never used
votar
them.
nas
Back in
coisas
fact,
sem
there
ser
was a little
coque
bit of
bloqueado.
evidence, and people like Mike Lodes and come up with some interesting examples, not all of them necessarily completely convincing, but nevertheless there's perhaps some evidence, and there's certainly artistic evidence, that longbows were sometimes used from horseback. However, by and large, it's an infantry bow. Much like
usar longbow de cavalo tá foda
longbows,
mesmo.
like the ones used in India, were predominantly
Isso,
on
fantástico.
foot, whereas these we generally used, or were the bows chosen to be used on horseback or elephant back as
O
well.
material é sinistro, a questão do material, velho. O cara falou na Índia tem, mas é um fato que o bagulho é mais perecível. Muito mais trabalhoso de fazer.
Okay. Now, moreover, if we go to the Hundred Years' War, where we have the best source material for these being used, there is an enormous amount of evidence, which I've talked about in previous videos, and also
Bora fazer 8 e vamos quebrar o recorde, né, pai?
Toby Capwell and Will Sherman and Todd and others, for what I call flat shooting. Okay? Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean, in a nutshell, is short distance pummeling. Okay? So, these bows, these composite recurve bows, are perhaps most famous even in modern
8, parece que tem progresso, parece que eu tô evoluindo.
light archery for sending arrows a long, long way. Okay? Not to say that they can't be used flat shooting at close range, of course they can. However, it does seem that because of the nature of European war,
Até falha, o último é até a falha. E a falha foi 2 a mais só. Só consegui fazer mais um.
from the nature of the bows, from the Mary Rose, but also looking at the arrows and the arrowheads, and the written sources. And it seems that
Mas eu não sei, ó. O bagulho é literalmente mais avançado. Eu fiz mais do que semana passada. Progressive Overload. Semana que vem eu faço com 10? Já evolui já de novo? Progressive Overload. Talvez quando eu tomar proteína eu vou ver se vai fazer uma diferença. Eu vou vir mais rápido do que ele, né? Mas é isso aí. E o máximo que eu vou fazer é 12, eu não faço então. Se eu chegar em 10, depois ficar 12. Aí eu tenho que achar um overload pra ficar mais difícil. Posso botar umas variações na mão, posso botar umas variações de explosivo, me jogar, bater uma palma. Mas tem que aumentar a dificuldade sempre. E até a falha. Aí, eu também comprei uma barra. Tem umas barras que bota aqui assim, ó. Ela não tem com barra de porta, ela bota na pressão assim. Só que eu comprei uma que tem parafuso, né? Quando eu sou insano. Aí eu tô em dúvida se eu boto aqui na porta. Se eu botar aqui pra frente não vai atrapalhar o batente, né? Só que aqui é muito pequeno, assim, ó, até pra pegar, eu pego aqui assim, ó, com facilidade. Então eu tô pensando que fica muito zoado pra eu pegar aqui assim, lá no topo. Então eu tô pensando em botar aqui, mas aqui tem mais de 1 metro, né? Eu comprei essa bosta aí, eu vou ver onde é que eu vou botar. Queria um lugar alto pra não bater minha cabeça, né? Pra poder ter espaço. E aqui eu só vou fazer até que assim eu vou meter meu nariz aqui. E eu quero fazer aquelas que eu posso subir assim, né? Fazer assim, subir, me jogar assim pra cima e fazer uns flexão lá, umas coisas lá. Mas eu comprei esse negócio aí, eu vou ver. Por hoje foi isso. Dia 11, completado. Muita facilidade, muita coisa pra fazer e meu braço não aguenta mais. Se ir lá, já tô caindo, já sem aguentar. Valeu.